Eastern Island, Midway Atoll, June 4, 1942. The sun had not yet cleared the horizon when the alarm went out across the coral. Marine pilots ran across packed sand toward a line of fighters that had been sitting in salt air and sun for months. They were young. Most of them were second lieutenants. 17 of them had arrived at this speck of land in the middle of the Pacific just 8 days earlier, straight from flight school. The aircraft waiting for them looked wrong. It was short and deep-bodied, with a rounded nose and a fat barrel of a fuselage that seemed to have been designed for a bigger engine than the one actually bolted inside it. It sat high on thin, spindly legs that folded up into the belly like an afterthought. Next to the sleek fighters filling newsreels back home, it looked like a cartoon of an aeroplane. It was called the Brewster F2A. Within 90 minutes, most of these men and most of these machines would be gone. The men who survived that morning did not blame the enemy. They blamed the aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel Ira Kimes, commanding the air group on the atoll, wrote afterward that the fighter should be pulled out of combat units entirely and sent to training commands, where it could do no more harm. That is an extraordinary thing for an officer to write about a frontline weapon in the middle of a war he is losing, but the men who flew it that day had already reached the same conclusion in stronger language. What happened over Midway was not a battle, it was a slaughter. 21 Brewsters and 7 Grumman Wildcats were on strength. 26 fighters got airborne, 1 turned back with engine trouble, and 25 engaged a Japanese strike force of 36 level bombers, 36 dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. 15 of the American fighters were shot down, 13 of them Brewsters. By the end of the day, only 2 of the squadron's aircraft remained fit to fly. The Marine Air Group on the atoll lost 46 aircraft in total across the battle. The squadron's commanding officer was killed, and the wreckage of that morning fixed the aircraft's reputation permanently in the English-speaking world. Flying coffin. The worst fighter of the war. 3 years earlier, that same aeroplane had been the pride of the United States Navy. It was the first monoplane fighter the Navy ever accepted for carrier service. It had beaten Grumman in open competition. It had been tested in the most advanced wind tunnel on Earth. Engineers had called it the future. And on the other side of the world, in a country of forests and frozen lakes that most Americans could not have found on a map, a stripped-down export version of this same aeroplane was being flown by a squadron that would claim 477 enemy aircraft, destroyed for the loss of 19 of its own in combat. That is a ratio of roughly 25 to 1. It is usually quoted as 26 to 1. Finnish pilots did not call it a coffin. They called it Taivaan helmi, the pearl of the skies. This is the story of how one aeroplane became the most ridiculed fighter of the Second World War in one hemisphere and one of the most successful in another, in the same years, against the same laws of physics. It is a story about weight, about corruption, about training, and about the uncomfortable truth that the machine is very often the least important thing in the equation. And it ends with a question that historians are still arguing about, because the famous Finnish number is not quite what it appears to be either. To understand how far the Brewster fell, you have to understand how high it started. In November of 1935, the United States Navy issued a requirement for a new carrier fighter to replace the Grumman F-3F biplane. The Navy wanted a monoplane. This was not an obvious choice. Carrier decks were short, arrestor gear was primitive, and biplanes with their low landing speeds and forgiving handling were what naval aviators trusted. Asking for a monoplane was asking for a leap. The Brewster Aeronautical Corporation submitted a design. Brewster was an odd company to be building fighters. It had grown out of a famous old carriage-building firm, a business that had once made horse-drawn coaches for wealthy New Yorkers, and it had been bought in the early 1930s by an aeronautical engineer named James Work. In 1932, the whole operation employed around 40 people. It had never built a fighter aircraft in its life. The design team was led by an engineer named Dayton T. Brown, and what they produced was genuinely advanced. The XF2A1 was an all-metal aeroplane with flush riveting, a mid-mounted wing, hydraulically retracting main landing gear, a partly retracting tailwheel, and a fully enclosed cockpit canopy. In 1937, that specification list was closer to the future than to the past. Its competitor was Grumman's XF4F1, and Grumman submitted a biplane. Let that sink in. The company that would go on to build the Wildcat, the Hellcat, and the Bearcat entered the competition of 1936 with 2 wings. A navalized version of the Seversky P-35 was also entered, and it was eliminated when it could not exceed 267 miles per hour. The Brewster prototype flew for the first time on December 2, 1937. It was powered by a Wright Cyclone 9-cylinder radial engine, producing around 950 horsepower for takeoff. Empty, it weighed a little over 3,700 pounds. Loaded, it came in just over 5,000. Those numbers matter enormously, and I want you to remember them, because everything that went wrong later is contained in them. Then came the moment that should have made the Brewster a legend. In May of 1938, the prototype was hauled to Langley Field in Virginia and became what is generally credited as the first complete full-size aircraft ever tested in the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics full-scale wind tunnel. Engineers examined the airflow over every surface and identified the drag penalties. They reshaped the engine cowling, they redesigned the carburetor intake and the oil cooler inlet. The result was startling. On exactly the same engine, top speed rose from about 277 miles per hour to about 304 miles per hour. That is a gain of roughly 10% for no extra power at all. It was such a convincing demonstration that full-scale wind tunnel testing became standard American practice from that point onward. The Brewster was ordered into production in June of 1938. The Navy had its first monoplane fighter. 2 of the most famous names in American naval aviation, John Thach and Edward O'Hare, both flew it in 1940. The theory was excellent. The airframe was clean. The company was about to destroy it. There is a single sentence that explains the entire American tragedy of the Brewster, and it is this. The aeroplane succeeded brilliantly at being light, and then it was never allowed to be light again. The first production version, the F2A1, gained weight almost immediately. Extra guns went into the wings. Combat equipment went into the fuselage. Initial rate of climb fell to around 2,600 feet per minute. Only 11 of them were ever delivered to the Navy. Then came the F2A2, with a more powerful engine of around 1,200 horsepower and a better propeller. Empty weight had climbed to roughly 4,576 pounds. Loaded weight was now nearly 6,000 pounds. It could reach about 323 miles per hour at 16,500 feet, though its rate of climb had already slipped to around 2,500 feet per minute under the extra load. By most assessments, it was still the best balanced version of the aircraft ever built. 43 were ordered. Then the war in Europe delivered its lessons, and those lessons all weighed something. Pilots were being killed because their fuel tanks caught fire, so self-sealing tanks went in. Pilots were being killed by machine gun fire from behind, so armor plate went in. Combat ranges were longer than anyone had planned for, so the fuselage was lengthened and fuel capacity went up to around 240 gallons. Every one of those decisions was correct. Every one of them was also a stone added to a rucksack. The result was the F2A3. Empty weight had reached about 4,732 pounds. Fully loaded, it now weighed around 7,159 pounds. Compare that to the prototype at just over 5,000 pounds loaded. The aircraft had gained more than 2,000 pounds, while its engine gained nothing at all. Its performance was measurably worse than the earlier F2A2. It climbed more slowly, it turned less tightly, it landed faster. 108 of these were built, and this was the version the United States Marine Corps took to Midway. There was a second problem, and it was structural. The main landing gear used a distinctive shape that engineers described as a W, and it was fragile. It had been marginal on the prototype. On the heavier versions, it began to fail regularly, particularly during carrier landings, where the impact loads were highest. There is a photograph, well known among naval aviation historians, of John Thatch tipping a Brewster onto its nose on the deck of the carrier Saratoga in March of 1940. Attempts were made to strengthen the gear. They were never fully successful. The heavier the aeroplane got, the worse the problem became. Early versions also suffered from carbon monoxide seeping into the cockpit, another warning sign that the design was being asked to carry more than it had been drawn to carry. But an overloaded aeroplane can usually be fixed. What could not be fixed was the company building it. Brewster Aeronautical went from around 40 employees in 1932 to roughly 20,000 during the war, and it was, by any reasonable standard, one of the worst-run defense contractors in American history. Its main factory was in Long Island City, in New York. It was a multi-story building. It had no airfield attached to it. Completed aircraft components had to be trucked out of the city to be assembled and flown, in the middle of a war, by a company that could not build them fast enough in the first place. Then there was the leadership. James Work brought in two brothers, Alfred and Ignacio Miranda, as salesmen. The Miranda brothers had criminal convictions for illegally trafficking arms to Bolivia in violation of American neutrality legislation and had served time in federal custody. Through an export corporation and a network of associated companies, the Mirandas and an associate were later alleged, in an investigation published by the Philadelphia Record, to have taken around $5.5 million out of the firm between November of 1939 and June of 1941, while ordinary shareholders received something in the region of $290,000 in dividends across the same period. Shareholders sued the chairman of the board. The workforce situation was equally poisonous. There were illicit strikes. Deliberate work slowdowns were documented in late 1942. Wartime steel shortages forced the company to build hangar beams out of wood. Rumors of sabotage circulated widely and were investigated. It is important to be precise here, because this is a story that has been badly distorted over the decades. Sabotage was suspected. It was never conclusively proven. What was proven was incompetence, and that was more than enough. The reckoning came in April of 1942. Brewster had been contracted to produce a dive bomber called the Buccaneer and had failed to deliver a single completed aircraft on schedule. On April 18, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9141, directing the Secretary of the Navy to take possession of the company's plants. 2 days later, a naval officer, Captain George C. Westervelt, took control of the Long Island City, Newark and Johnsville facilities, citing dissatisfaction with management. The government held the plants for almost exactly 1 month, handing them back to a Navy-appointed board on May 20th under a second executive order that revoked the first. In May of 1943, the Navy tried again, installing a fresh board headed by the industrialist Henry Kaiser, the man who had already transformed American shipbuilding. Brewster was also given a license to build the Vought Corsair, one of the finest fighters of the war, and the aircraft that came out of the Brewster factory were of such poor quality that many were judged unfit for combat use. The Navy cancelled the final Corsair contract in July of 1944. The company was dissolved by its own shareholders in 1946. So by the time American Marines climbed into their Brewsters at Midway, they were flying an aircraft that had been made heavy by good intentions and built by a company that could barely function. The men who died in those cockpits deserved better than both. Before Midway, there was Malaya. In December of 1941, the British, Australian, and New Zealand Air Forces defending Malaya and Singapore were equipped with an export version of the Brewster, designated the B339E. It was heavy. It was underpowered. It had a hand-operated fuel pump that the pilot had to work himself. Above about 18,000 feet, the fuel system tended to starve the engine. Against Japanese fighters, flown by combat-experienced pilots, this was close to a death sentence. And yet the results were not the total humiliation that popular history suggests. Commonwealth Brewster squadrons claimed around 80 Japanese aircraft, most of them bombers, for a kill-to-loss ratio of somewhere around 1.3 to 1. That is not a triumph. It is also not a massacre. One man in particular complicates the simple story of Commonwealth failure. Geoffrey Fisken was a New Zealander flying with a Royal Air Force squadron over Singapore, and in the space of about 3 weeks in January and February of 1942, he was credited with 6 victories in a Brewster. His victims included a Japanese Army fighter, 2 twin-engined naval bombers, and 3 Zeros. He would end the war as the highest-scoring British Commonwealth fighter pilot of the entire Pacific Theatre, and more than half of his total was scored in the aircraft everyone insists was useless. He was not alone either. At least 3 Commonwealth pilots became aces flying Brewsters in that catastrophic campaign, and some tallies put the figure at 4, depending on how shared and contested claims are counted. Fisken's own assessment, given decades later, is one of the fairest things anyone ever said about the aircraft. He described it as a delight to fly and a beautiful aeroplane, but underpowered. And then he added the part that actually mattered. The Zeros were too fast, and they could turn inside it, and if you chose to dogfight one, you were simply committing suicide. That is a pilot describing an aircraft that was pleasant, competent, and completely outclassed by the specific opponent it had been sent to face. It is a far more useful verdict than the word coffin, and it points directly at the thing that would save the type elsewhere. Change the opponent, and everything changes. Something more interesting happened in the Netherlands East Indies. The Dutch air arm flew lighter versions of the same fighter, and they did better. On February 19, 1942, 8 Dutch Brewsters intercepted a formation of around 35 bombers, escorted by roughly 20 Zeros over Semplak, and claimed 11 for the loss of 4. Across the campaign, Dutch pilots claimed around 55 aircraft for roughly 30 losses in air combat. Lighter aeroplane, better result. Nobody at the time drew the obvious conclusion. Then came June 4, 1942, and the morning on Eastern Island. Radar picked up the incoming Japanese strike at about 5:55 in the morning, around 93 miles out. The Marine Fighter Squadron was led by Major Floyd B. Parks, and he organized his aircraft into 4 divisions of Brewsters and 1 of Wildcats. His problem was not fundamentally that his aeroplanes were slow. His problem was that 35 of the 57 aviators who flew that day were second lieutenants, none of whom had been with the squadron more than 4 months, and a large proportion of whom had come straight from training. They had been taught to fight as individuals. They were about to meet one of the most experienced fighter forces in the world. Parks was shot down. He got out of his burning aircraft, and he did not survive. Captain William Humbird was credited with a bomber and a Zero. Captain Marion Carl, who would go on to become one of the great Marine aces of the war, survived. Captain Kirk Armistead led a division of 12 Brewsters into the fight. Second Lieutenant Charles Kuntz was credited with 2 dive bombers. 15 Marine fighters did not come back. The mechanics of the disaster are not difficult to reconstruct. The heavily loaded F2A3 could not climb fast enough to reach the ideal intercepting altitude in the time available. Its single-stage supercharger, a weakness identified as far back as the wind tunnel tests of 1938, meant its engine lost power in the thinner air where the interception took place. Once the escorts came down, the Brewsters could neither outturn a Zero nor reliably outrun one, and the American pilots, lacking training in mutual support, broke into individual dogfights, which was precisely the fight the Japanese most wanted. There is a further, quieter tragedy in the numbers. Kimes initially estimated that around 43 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. Surviving pilots claimed about 9. Modern analysis published by the United States Naval Institute concludes that the squadron probably shot down 3 outright, with perhaps 16 more Japanese aircraft damaged badly enough that they ditched or never flew again. Hold that thought. We are going to come back to the gap between what pilots believe they have done and what actually happened, because it is the single most important idea in the second half of this story. After the battle, Captain Philip R. White wrote a post-action statement that has followed the Brewster for 80 years. He said that the F2A-3 was not a combat aeroplane, that it was inferior to the aircraft it was fighting in every respect, and that any commander who ordered pilots out to fight in one should consider those pilots lost before they left the ground. That is as damning as any sentence ever written about an American aircraft. Kimes agreed with it. The recommendation went up the chain that the Brewster and 2 other types be withdrawn from combat and sent to training units. And measured against the specific aircraft that the Marines were flying, on that specific morning, with those specific pilots, White was right. The case was closed. Except that at that very moment, more than 5,000 miles away, the same basic aeroplane was in the middle of one of the most successful fighter campaigns of the entire war. To understand why, we have to go back to the winter of 1939 and to a country that was fighting for its existence. When the Soviet Union invaded Finland in November of 1939, the Finnish Air Force was tiny and largely obsolete. Finland went looking for modern fighters anywhere it could find them, and it had approached the United States as early as April of 1939. There was a legal obstacle. American neutrality legislation restricted arms sales. But Finland had one enormous advantage in Washington, and it was not military. Finland was widely known as the nation that had continued to repay its debts from the First World War, when almost every other European country had defaulted. That reputation mattered. In October of 1939, the transfer of aircraft was approved. On December 16, 1939, with Soviet bombs already falling on Helsinki, Finland signed a contract for 44 Brewster Model 239 fighters. The total price was around $3.4 million, working out at roughly $54,000 per aircraft including delivery, along with 10 spare engines, 20 spare propellers, and a stock of parts. And here is the detail that decides everything that follows. Before shipping, Brewster stripped the aircraft of all United States Navy equipment. Out came the arrestor hook, out came the catapult fittings, out came the life raft, the naval instruments, the guns and the gun sights. What Finland bought was not a naval fighter, it was the skeleton of a naval fighter. The engines fitted were export-approved Wright Cyclones of around 950 horsepower. Finnish and American researchers have long reported that some of these were reconditioned units taken from civil airliners because military specification engines were not available for foreign sale. That claim is widely repeated and should be treated as probable rather than certain. Getting them to Finland was its own small epic. The first aircraft left New York in January of 1940. They were shipped to Norway, moved by rail into Sweden, and assembled at Trollhättan by a mixed crew of Swedish, Norwegian, and British volunteers. Only around 6 of them reached Finland before the Winter War ended on March 13, 1940. The rest arrived by about the 1st of May. The aircraft that would become Finland's most famous fighter missed the war it was bought for entirely. What happened next was quiet, unglamorous, and absolutely decisive. The Finns spent a year modifying the aircraft based on what they had just learned in combat. They fitted armor behind the pilot's seat and head, a direct lesson from the Winter War. They replaced the instruments with metric ones. They removed the original telescopic gun sight and fitted a modern reflector sight of Finnish design based on a German pattern. They armed it with heavy machine guns, eventually 450 caliber weapons. One detail is worth settling plainly here because it distracts people every time Finnish aircraft appear on screen. The blue swastika painted on the wings of every Finnish military aeroplane in this story had nothing whatsoever to do with Nazi Germany. Finland adopted it as its national aircraft marking in 1918, before the Nazi Party existed. A Swedish count had donated the country's very first aeroplane, and it carried his personal good luck symbol, an ancient design used by cultures all over the world for thousands of years. Finland simply kept it, It remained on Finnish aircraft for decades, and it carried no political meaning of any kind. And when it was finished, the Finnish Brewster weighed around 5,820 pounds fully loaded. The American F2A3 at Midway weighed around 7,159 pounds. The difference is roughly 1,300 pounds. That is not a variation. That is a different aeroplane wearing the same skin. The Finns never once called it a Buffalo. That name was British, applied to the export aircraft sent to Malaya, and it never travelled north. Finnish pilots and ground crews invented their own vocabulary for the machine, and it tells you a great deal about how they actually felt about it. The name that is best attested in the Finnish records is Taivaan Helmi, the pearl of the skies. But affection in a fighter squadron rarely comes without mockery, and the same aircraft was also known, on account of its unmistakable rear end, by a nickname that translates roughly as Backside Walter. Popular accounts add several more, including the American hardware and the flying beer barrel, though those are less firmly documented as wartime usage. You do not give an aeroplane a string of insulting nicknames unless you are extremely fond of it. Only 3 of the Finnish Brewsters are documented as carrying personal names painted on them. One was called 3 Brothers, paid for by 3 Swedish brothers who wanted to help. One was named in honor of a man called Otto Vrede. The third was named Noka, and it has the best story of the 3. It was donated by 2 Finnish industrial firms, a rubber works and a cable works, and the name painted on its nose was a contraction stitched together from both of them. Those companies would not formally merge for another quarter of a century. When they finally did, in the 1960s, joining with a paper mill on the river that gave them all their name, the result was a corporation almost everyone watching this will have heard of. A rubber factory and a cable factory bought a fighter aeroplane in 1940, and the company they became was Nokia. Finland's Brewsters went to Lentolaivue 24, a fighter squadron commanded by Major Gustaf Erik Magnusson, a man known in Finnish aviation as the grand old man of the fighter force. Magnusson was not simply a squadron commander. He was, with Colonel Richard Lawrence, one of the 2 men most responsible for the tactical doctrine that would make the Brewster lethal. Both had studied French and German fighter tactics during the 1930s, and both had concluded that the rigid formations then in use across most of the world's air forces were obsolete. The Finnish Air Force adopted a flexible 4-aircraft formation built around widely spaced pairs, years before most air forces did. They called the basic formation a parvi, which translates roughly as a swarm. This sounds like a small technical detail. It is not. It is the whole story. Lentolaivue 24 also had something the Marines at Midway did not have. It had veterans. The squadron had already fought the entire Winter War, flying the Fokker D-21, a fixed undercarriage fighter with a fraction of the Brewster's performance, and on the best supported accounting, it claimed around 120 victories in that war, the overwhelming majority of them bombers, for very light losses of its own. When these men climbed into a Brewster in 1941, they were not learning to fight. They were being handed a better tool for a job they already knew. There is a line from Ilmari Juutilainen, who would become the highest-scoring non-German fighter pilot in history, that captures how Finnish pilots felt about the aircraft. He described the Brewster as a gentleman's touring aeroplane. He also described its handling in combat in terms that would have astonished a Marine at Midway, writing of closing so tightly on a target that he could count the rivets on it. The continuation war began on June 25, 1941, and the Brewster went to work immediately. That same day, a pair of Finnish Brewsters flown by Staff Sergeant Eero Kinnunen and Corporal Heimo Lampi scrambled from their base at Selanpää in southern Finland and caught a formation of 27 Soviet bombers near Heinola, only a few minutes flying time away. The Soviet crews were hunting for the squadron's main airfield and never found it. Between them, Kinnunen and Lampi claimed 5 of the 27 shot down. Kinnunen would go on flying this aircraft until April of 1943, when anti-aircraft fire killed him over the eastern Gulf of Finland. His final score was 22.5 victories, 19 of them in the Brewster. Remember Lampy's name as well. He has the last word on this aircraft later. Which brings us to the part of this story that is usually left out, and which explains more than the aeroplane ever could. The Brewster's Finnish success was not a miracle. It was a set of conditions that happened to line up almost perfectly, and if you remove any one of them, the whole result collapses. The first condition was weight, which we have already covered. The second was altitude. The war in the far north was fought low. Soviet bombers came in at moderate heights, ground attack aircraft came in lower still, and the high-altitude fighting that exposed the Brewster's weak supercharger over the Pacific largely did not happen. The third was temperature. The right cyclone ran hot and had a habit of overheating in tropical conditions, which is precisely where British and Dutch Brewsters had been sent. In Finland, the engine ran in cold, dense air for most of the year. The same power plant that struggled over Singapore was comfortable over Karelia. The fourth condition, and the largest single factor, was the opposition. In 1941 and much of 1942, the Soviet aircraft the Brewsters met were largely obsolescent. The I-16 was a stubby, fast-rolling monoplane already past its prime. The I-153 was a biplane. The SB was a fast bomber of the mid-1930s that was no longer fast. Behind these machines sat an Air Force that had lost a devastating proportion of its experienced officers in the purges of the late 1930s, and whose pilot training in this period was, by common agreement among historians on all sides, badly inadequate. Soviet formations on the Finnish front were still using rigid three-aircraft flights and defensive circles. The Finns had spent years preparing for exactly this. The fifth condition was the ground crew, and this is the part that almost nobody talks about. Finland could not buy spare parts. It was fighting alongside Germany as a co-belligerent, which meant American supply was gone the moment the shooting started. So Finland made its own. The state aircraft factory at Tampere reverse-engineered components and manufactured them domestically. Mechanics worked out that reversing the fitting of one piston ring per cylinder improved the reliability of the Cyclone engine. Ground crews became so attached to their aircraft that during the frequent base moves, crew chiefs would ride in the baggage compartment rather than be separated from their machine. Later in the war, when American engines simply could not be replaced, a number of Finnish Brewsters were re-engined with captured Soviet Shvetsov radials, which were themselves derived from a licensed version of the Cyclone. It was an American aeroplane, flown by Finns, kept alive by Finnish factories, powered in part by Russian engines taken from the enemy. There is no neater summary of Finland's war. Finland even attempted to build its own copy. The design was called the Humu, with a plywood wing to save scarce metal, and only one prototype ever flew, in August of 1944. The wooden wing added significant weight, the fuel tanks had to be moved, and the handling suffered. It was tested, judged inferior to the original, and abandoned. Even Finland could not repeat the trick, because the trick had never been the aeroplane. Now, before we get to what the Brewster actually did in combat, and to the awkward business of how many of those 477 victories were real, take 1 second to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it makes a genuine difference to a channel like this one. Right, let us get back to Karelia. The aircraft that Lentolaivue 24 took into the continuation war was, in its Finnish configuration, a genuinely capable fighter for its time and place. It made around 297 miles per hour at roughly 15,600 feet. It carried 4 heavy machine guns. It had armor for the pilot, a modern reflector gun sight, excellent all-round visibility from a high-mounted cockpit, and long endurance. Most importantly, it was light enough that its 950 horsepower engine could actually move it. Power-to-weight ratio is the number that decides whether a fighter climbs, accelerates, and recovers energy after a turn, and the Finnish Brewsters was far better than the American versions. It also had one virtue that pilots consistently praised and that rarely shows up in specification tables. It was a stable, honest gun platform. It did not wander, It did not snap. A pilot could aim it and trust it, and in a war decided by short bursts at difficult angles, that mattered more than 20 miles per hour of top speed. The Finnish fighter force was small. This was never a campaign of massed formations. Finland's entire Brewster inventory was 44 aircraft, and the operational strength of the squadron at any given moment was a fraction of that. What Finland had instead of numbers was a system, and the system was where the results came from. The Finnish method worked like this. A flight of 4 aircraft, the Parvi, flew in 2 widely separated pairs, each pair consisting of a leader and a wingman whose job was to protect him. Because the pairs were spaced far apart, every pilot could spend his time looking outward for the enemy instead of inward at the aircraft next to him. This sounds trivial. It was revolutionary. The rigid, close formations used by the Soviets and by most air forces early in the war forced pilots to concentrate on not colliding with their neighbors, which meant that entire formations could be surprised by an attack that a single properly spaced pair would have spotted minutes earlier. The standard Finnish fighter formation was 8 aircraft in 2 of these flights, and they were used in a deliberately layered way. One pair would fly low, visible, apparently isolated. The second pair sat high above them and slightly behind. When Soviet fighters dived on the low pair, the high pair dived on the Soviet fighters. It is a simple trap. It worked because the enemy kept walking into it. On top of the formation flying sat gunnery. Finnish pilots were trained relentlessly in deflection shooting, the difficult art of aiming ahead of a crossing target so that the bullets and the aeroplane arrive at the same point in space at the same moment. Combined with the discipline of holding fire until the range was very short, this made a modest 4-gun armament extraordinarily effective. Juutilainen and others regularly opened fire from inside 50 meters. At that distance, the deflection problem largely disappears, and 4 heavy machine guns are more than enough to destroy any aircraft in the sky. The Brewsters were used for everything. They intercepted bombers attacking Finnish cities and railways. They escorted Finnish reconnaissance aircraft. They flew fighter sweeps over the Karelian Isthmus and the Gulf of Finland. They fought Soviet ground attack formations attacking Finnish positions, which was where the heaviest and most dangerous fighting usually took place, because attacking a low-flying aircraft over its own troops meant flying through everything those troops could throw upward. The scale of individual Finnish success in these years is difficult to overstate, and it is concentrated in a remarkably small number of men and machines. 36 Finnish pilots became aces flying the Brewster. 6 of Finland's 10 highest-scoring pilots of the entire war reached that status in one. Hans Wind was credited with 39 victories on the type, more than any other Brewster pilot in any air force. Juutilainen was credited with 34 of his 94.5 total in it. Jorma Karhunen scored around 26 of his roughly 31.5. Lauri Nissinen accounted for around 22.5 of his 32.5. Individual airframes accumulated tallies that sound impossible. After post-war reassessment of the records, the aircraft with the serial BW364, Juutilainen's regular mount, and the machine in which he scored 28 of his 34 Brewster victories, is credited with 42.5 victories by all its pilots combined. That figure, if accepted, would make it possibly the highest-scoring individual fighter airframe in history. The aircraft BW393, flown chiefly by Hans Wind, is credited with around 41. Both of those numbers rest on Finnish credited claims rather than on fully reconciled Soviet records, and I will come back to exactly what that distinction means shortly. The single most concentrated example of the Finnish method came on August 12, 1942, over Antrea on the Karelian Isthmus. Jorma Karhunen led 6 Brewsters against a Soviet ground attack formation of roughly 20 aircraft. The fight lasted around 30 minutes. The Finns claimed 9 of the biplane fighters shot down and returned without loss, 6 aircraft against 20. That is the doctrine working exactly as designed, and it is worth noticing what actually produced the result. Not speed, not firepower, position, surprise, mutual support, and shooting from close range. But none of this was free, and it is important not to let the arithmetic hide the cost. Finnish pilots were flying against an enemy with vastly greater resources, over territory where a forced landing frequently meant coming down on the wrong side of the line, in a climate where survival after a bailout was measured in hours. On June 25, 1942, exactly 1 year after the type's first combat, Lieutenant Lauri was flying BW-372 in a formation of 8 over a Soviet airfield when his left-wing tank was hit and caught fire. He had already shot down 2 Soviet-flown Hurricanes on that mission. He put the burning aircraft down on the surface of a lake in Russian Karelia and made it back to the Finnish lines. More than 50 years later, studying photographs of the damage on the recovered airframe, Pakuri overturned his own wartime combat report. The explosive shell strikes, he concluded, meant the aircraft which finally got him had not been a Hurricane at all, but a Soviet-built MiG-3. The aeroplane sank where it landed, and it stayed there for 56 years. Remember that lake. We will return to it at the end. Now we come to the most important part of this story, and to the reason I have been careful all the way through to use the word claimed. Let us look at what happened on the other side of the fight. Soviet accounts and unit records from the Finnish front describe an enemy that was consistently arriving from an unexpected direction, in small numbers, at high speed, and leaving before a coordinated response could be organized. The Soviet response was tactical rather than technical. Formations tightened. Defensive circles were adopted, in which aircraft flew in a ring so that each protected the tail of the one ahead, a formation that is effective at preventing losses and almost useless for achieving anything else. Fighter escorts were bound more closely to the bombers they were protecting, which surrendered the initiative entirely. That is what a genuinely effective fighter force looks like from the receiving end. Not dramatic quotations, but a slow narrowing of what the other side is willing to attempt. And the measurable consequence was that Soviet air operations over the Finnish front in 1941 and 1942 were conducted with a caution that their overwhelming numerical superiority did not require. But the famous number itself has to be examined honestly, because it will not survive contact with a well-informed comment section otherwise. 477 victories for 19 combat losses is a claimed figure. It comes from Finnish squadron records. It is not a count of Soviet aircraft verified as destroyed in Soviet documents. And since the opening of the Russian archives, Finnish historians have been doing exactly that verification work, most notably Carl Fredrik Gust, Kari Stenman, and Kalevi Keskinen. What they found is what researchers have found for every air force in the Second World War without exception. The claims are higher than the losses. Some specific examples make the scale clear. On April 6, 1942, over Tiiksjärvi, Finnish pilots claimed 2 bombers and 12 fighters. Soviet records for the action show 1 bomber and 6 fighters lost. On August 18, 1942, Lentolaivue 24 claimed 16 aircraft in total. Cross-referencing against Soviet Naval Air Force records indicates 6 actual losses. For the desperate fighting of June 1944, one detailed Finnish study matched claims to Soviet documents at a ratio of about 1 to 2.23, meaning roughly 2 claims for every confirmed loss, while a separate analysis by the historian Hannu Valtonen found only around 146 of 397 fighter claims from that month could be confirmed. There is a pattern inside these numbers that is genuinely useful. Claims against bombers were far more accurate than claims against fighters, typically inflated by around half rather than by multiples. That makes intuitive sense. A large bomber falling in flames is unambiguous and usually seen by many witnesses. A fighter that dives away trailing smoke may be destroyed, or it may be a pilot escaping in exactly the way pilots are trained to escape. This matters here because the Brewster's early victories in 1941 and 1942 were disproportionately against bombers and slow ground attack aircraft. The part of the Finnish record most likely to be accurate is precisely the part the Brewster is most responsible for. There is a fair counter-argument, and it deserves to be stated properly. The Finnish confirmation system was relatively strict, particularly early in the war. A victory generally required a witness. Either the destruction had to be visibly observed, or the enemy pilot had to be seen taking to his parachute. Probables were not counted at all, which is a stricter standard than several major air forces applied. Finnish researchers themselves, however, have concluded that the system loosened considerably during the crisis fighting of 1944, and that Finnish records contain, in their own phrase, as much air in them as anyone else's. So what is the honest answer? Applying the overclaim ratios that the archival work supports, the real figure is lower than 477, and the true ratio is probably somewhere in the region of 10-1 or 15-1 rather than 26-1. And here is why that changes almost nothing. A 10-1 exchange rate is still one of the most lopsided sustained performances by any fighter unit in the Second World War. Overclaiming was universal, not Finnish. Soviet claims at Kursk have been assessed as inflated by something in the region of 7 or 8 times. American bomber gunners overclaimed by ratios in the region of 7-1 or worse, simply because a dozen men firing at the same fighter each honestly reported hitting it. British claims during the Battle of Britain were out by close to half when compared with German records after the war. Even the German system, generally the most rigorous of any combatant, produced inflated totals in periods of heavy fighting. None of this was fraud. It was smoke, adrenaline, closing speeds of hundreds of miles per hour, and multiple pilots firing at the same aircraft in the same 3 seconds. Every air force in history has done it. There is one further correction worth making, because it is repeated constantly and it is wrong. The Finnish Brewster is often described as holding the highest victory-to-loss ratio of any fighter of the war. It does not. The historian Barrett Tillman notes that the distinction belongs to the Grumman and Eastern-built FM-2 Wildcat, an aircraft flown from small escort carriers in the last year of the Pacific War, which achieved a ratio of around 32-1. That the Brewster is in the same conversation at all remains remarkable. It also helps to place the aircraft honestly against its contemporaries, conceding where it loses. Against the Grumman Wildcat, the Brewster loses on almost every measure that matters late in a war. The Wildcat was heavier, but had a 2-stage supercharger, which gave it usable power at high altitude, where the Brewster's engine was gasping. It was more ruggedly built and absorbed the inevitable weight growth far more gracefully. Grumman, unlike Brewster, was a company that could actually manufacture aircraft. But the Wildcat was less agile at low level, and in the specific low-altitude war fought over Karelia, the Brewster's lightness was worth more than the Wildcat's ceiling. Against the Japanese Zero, the Brewster loses on climb, on turn, and on range. The Zero climbed at over 3,000 feet per minute and could outturn essentially anything. But it achieved this by carrying no armor and no self-sealing tanks, and its controls became heavy and unresponsive above about 300 miles per hour. A Finnish Brewster, armored and firing heavy machine guns, would have been in a very different kind of fight against a Zero than the overloaded American version was. Against the Soviet I-16, the type it most often met, the Brewster was faster, better armed, better protected, and vastly better handled tactically. This is not a criticism of the Brewster. It is simply the truth about why the numbers look the way they do. Against the Hawker Hurricane, which the Brewster met in Soviet hands under Lend-Lease, the comparison is close. The Hurricane was faster and famously tough, and could be a serious opponent. Pekuri shot down 2 of them on the day he lost his own aircraft, which tells you both that it could be beaten, and that beating it was not free. There is a real cost buried in this story, and it is not evenly distributed. Finland's Brewster losses were remarkably light. 19 aircraft lost in air combat across 3 years, with around 6 more destroyed in accidents or on the ground. Set against that, consider the men who flew the same design elsewhere. Dutch Brewster units lost around 30 aircraft in the air and 15 more destroyed on the ground, and 17 Dutch pilots were killed. Commonwealth squadrons in Malaya and Singapore were effectively destroyed as fighting units within weeks. On Midway, 15 Marine fighters went down in a single morning, and the squadron lost pilots at a rate that would have annihilated it within days had the battle continued. The same aeroplane. The difference was never courage, because there was no shortage of that anywhere. The difference was 1,300 pounds of equipment, several thousand hours of formation training, an enemy who was still learning, and a climate that suited the engine. The Brewster's own end came quietly, and earlier than most people assume. Production had ceased entirely in March of 1942, only 3 months after America entered the war. 509 were built in total, across all versions and all customers, a tiny figure by wartime standards, and one that reflects how quickly the world moved past it. By early 1943, only around 24 remained operational in Finland. The men who flew it were entirely clear-eyed about why it had stopped working, and Jorma Karhunen said so plainly after the war. He explained that the Brewster had been good against the older Russian fighters, the biplane and the stubby monoplane, and that this was why the period of 1941 to 1942 had been the best time for his squadron. By 1943, he said, it had already become significantly more difficult as the Soviets began putting newer fighters into the line. And when the newer types arrived in numbers, the Yaks, the Hurricanes, the American-built fighters, and the modern Soviet designs, it became, in his words, a fight to the death. That is a Finnish ace, one of the highest-scoring Brewster pilots in the world, stating openly that his aircraft's record was a function of who it was fighting. He had no incentive to say that, and every reason not to. It is the single most honest sentence in this entire story. Germany began delivering Messerschmitt fighters to Finland in 1943, and through that year and into the next, the Finnish fighter units converted. In the spring of 1944, Lentolaivue 24 handed its surviving Brewsters, around 15 of them, to another squadron, which used them increasingly for training and reconnaissance work rather than frontline interception. The last Brewster victory against Soviet aircraft was scored over the Karelian Isthmus on June 17, 1944. Then came a final strange chapter that almost no one outside Finland knows about. When Finland signed an armistice with the Soviet Union in September of 1944, the terms required Finland to expel German forces from its territory, and Finnish troops found themselves fighting their former co-belligerents in the far north. On October 3, 1944, Finnish Brewsters intercepted German dive bombers and claimed 2 of them. An American-built fighter, bought to fight the Soviet Union, shooting down German aircraft over Lapland. Those were the last Brewster victories ever recorded, in any Air Force, anywhere. There is a remark from a Finnish pilot named Heimo Lampi, who converted from the Brewster to the Messerschmitt, that says something no performance chart can. He described the Messerschmitt as a real hard fighter, a far more capable weapon in every measurable way, and then said that it totally lacked in humaneness. He was not being sentimental. He meant that the German fighter was unforgiving, that it punished error, that its narrow landing gear and vicious stall would kill a tired man at the end of a long sortie. The Brewster forgave you. In a small air force that could not replace pilots, forgiveness was a combat capability, and it never appeared in a single specification table. It is worth pausing on how few of these aircraft ever existed. 509 were built in total, across every version and every customer, and the breakdown is startling for a machine this famous. The United States Navy and Marine Corps received around 163. Britain and the Commonwealth took roughly 170. The Netherlands East Indies received around 71. Belgium ordered 40 and was overrun before it could fly a single one in anger, and those aircraft scattered across the world in the collapse. Exactly 1 reached France, where it sat in its packing crate at Bordeaux until the Germans captured it. 6 were loaded aboard a French aircraft carrier bound for the Caribbean, put ashore in Martinique when France surrendered, and left to rot in the tropics. The remaining 33 went to Britain. Some of those flew from Crete with the Fleet Air Arm and were evacuated to Egypt days before the German airborne invasion. Australia ended up with about 20 former Dutch machines, and Finland, the only operator to make the aircraft genuinely famous, bought 44. 44 aeroplanes out of a global production run smaller than a single month's output of some wartime fighters are responsible for essentially the entire positive reputation of the type. 8 aircraft were still on strength at the end. 5 kept flying into the post-war years, and the very last Finnish Brewster flights took place on September 14, 1948. The survivors were put into storage, and by 1953, every one of them had been scrapped. Of 509 aircraft built, not one complete original survives in flying condition anywhere on Earth, and for decades it appeared that none survived at all. Which brings us back to a lake in Russian Karelia. In August of 1998, a recovery team lifted BW372 out of the water, where Lauri had left it 56 years earlier. Cold fresh water is extraordinarily kind to aluminium, and the aircraft came up in remarkable condition, still carrying the battle damage from the fight that put it there. What followed was less dignified. The aircraft was moved to an airfield, passed into the hands of a Moscow trading firm, taken out of Russia in circumstances that remain disputed, and surfaced at Shannon in Ireland in December of that year. In 2004, it was acquired by the National Naval Aviation Museum at Pensacola in Florida. And then something rather admirable happened. Since 2009, BW372 has been on long-term loan to the Finnish Aviation Museum, and it has deliberately not been restored. It sits conserved exactly as it came out of the lake, holes and all. A proposal to rebuild it in United States Navy markings drew objections from preservationists, on the reasonable grounds that repainting the only surviving Brewster fighter on the planet, as something it never was, would destroy the one thing that makes it irreplaceable. It is the sole survivor of the entire type, and the only battle-damaged aircraft in that museum's collection. Components from BW393, Hans Wind's aircraft, also survive. The single Humu prototype survives too, restored in the early 1970s, a plywood-winged monument to a good idea that did not work. And in June of 2012, the wreck of an American F2A3 was located in shallow water off Midway Atoll, ditched in February of that terrible year by First Lieutenant Charles W. Summers, Jr. 2 replicas exist. That is the complete inventory. Everything else was melted down. So what do we actually make of the Brewster? The temptation is to say it was misunderstood, that the Finns proved the critics wrong, that a good aeroplane was unfairly maligned. That is not true, and it is not what the evidence supports. Philip White was not wrong. The F2A3 he was ordered to fly at Midway genuinely was inferior to what it was fighting, and men genuinely did die because of it. Brewster, the company, genuinely was corrupt and incompetent, and the seizure of its factories by the United States Navy in 1942 was entirely justified. The landing gear was weak, the supercharger was inadequate, and the design had no capacity left to absorb the equipment that modern air combat demanded. The opposite temptation is to say the Finnish record was inflated, and therefore hollow. That is not true either. The claims were high, as every Air Force's claims were high, but the corrected figures still describe one of the outstanding fighter campaigns of the war. The real answer is more uncomfortable than either, and it is the reason this story is worth telling. The Brewster was not a bad aeroplane or a good one. It was a narrow one. It had a very small window in which it worked, defined by weight, by altitude, by temperature, and above all, by the quality of the men flying it and the men flying against it. Finland found that window and lived inside it for 3 years. America and Britain flew the aircraft straight through the edges of it and paid for the difference in pilots. That is not a lesson about Brewster. It is a lesson about how badly we misjudge weapons in general. We rank them like sports teams, best to worst, as though performance were a property of the metal. It is not. It never has been. The most decisive variables in air combat during the Second World War were training, tactics, doctrine, maintenance, and the competence of the opposition, and the aeroplane was frequently the smallest term in the equation. There is one image that captures it better than any statistic. On the 4th of June 1942, a young American second lieutenant with a few weeks in the squadron took off from a coral island in an overloaded fighter, alone in the sense that mattered, and was killed by men who had been fighting for 5 years. On roughly the same day, on the other side of the planet, a Finnish sergeant, who had been flying combat since 1939, took off in a lighter version of the same machine, with a wingman trained to protect him and a second pair waiting above, and came home. The aeroplane was not the variable. The aeroplane was never the variable. And that is why one of them is remembered as a flying coffin, and the other one is sitting in a museum in Finland, still full of holes, still called the Pearl of the Skies.